April 1945. Somewhere in central Germany. An African-American soldier stands before the gates of a concentration camp and cannot believe his eyes. His entire life, he'd faced racial discrimination in his own country. He knew what it meant to be treated as less than human. He'd lived with whites-only signs, with segregation, with the daily humiliation of being considered a second-class citizen. But what he sees now? This is racism taken to its absolute, monstrous extreme. Skeletons in striped clothing stare at him from behind barbed wire. Mountains of corpses lie by the barracks, and the smell of death, thick, inescapable, hangs in the air. In that moment he understands. This is what they were fighting against. This is where the path of racial hatred leads when nobody stops it. This is the story of African-American soldiers who witnessed and liberated Nazi concentration camps. A story about the collision of two realities of racism, American segregation and Nazi genocide. And it's a story that changed these men forever. The spring of 1945 brought the Allies rapid victory. The German army was collapsing, and American forces were racing deep into the heart of Nazi Germany. Among these troops were tens of thousands of African-American soldiers, men who'd grown up knowing a different kind of oppression back home. Picture this. You're a black soldier from the American South. You can't eat in the same restaurants as white people, can't drink from the same water fountains, can't go to the same schools. You've seen German prisoners of war, literal Nazis, walk into American diners where you, an American soldier in uniform, are told you're not welcome. You know racism. You've lived it every single day of your life. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could prepare you for what you're about to see in Germany. In mid-April 1945, a young sergeant named Leon Bass from Philadelphia was moving through Germany with the 183rd Engineer Combat Battalion. It was a segregated unit, of course. Even in the army supposedly fighting for freedom, black soldiers and white soldiers were kept separate. The war was winding down. German resistance was crumbling. But American forces were making a series of discoveries that would change how the world understood evil itself. On April 11, 1945, elements of the 6th Armored Division stumbled upon something near the town of Weimar. At first, they thought it might be a military installation. There were watchtowers, barbed wire, massive compounds. But as they got closer, they realized this was something entirely different. This was Buchenwald. 6 days later, on April 17th, Leon Bass and other members of the 183rd Engineer Combat Battalion arrived at the camp. They'd been sent to help with support operations, fixing water systems, handling infrastructure, the kind of technical work engineer battalions did. They had no idea they were about to witness hell on earth. The SS guards had fled days earlier, abandoning thousands of prisoners, or what was left of them. This wasn't a prisoner of war camp. This was something the world had never seen before, at least not at this scale. This was a factory of death, where the Nazis had been systematically murdering human beings for 12 long years. Bass and his fellow soldiers stood at the gates of Buchenwald, and their entire understanding of human nature was about to shatter. The first thing that hit them was the smell. Not the smell of battle, they knew that smell. This was different. Sweet, rotten, nauseating. The smell of decay, of mass death, hanging in the air like a toxic fog. You couldn't escape it. It filled your nose, your lungs, stuck to your clothes. Then they saw the people. Except, could you even call them people anymore? Living skeletons shuffled toward them, wearing striped prison uniforms that hung off their bodies like clothes on a coat hanger. Their eyes, huge, sunken, desperate, stared out from skull-like faces. Skin pulled tight over bones. Many could barely walk. Leon Bass felt his legs go weak. He'd seen death in combat. He'd seen friends blown apart, enemies killed in battle. But this was something completely different. This wasn't the chaos of war. This was organized, systematic, industrial. This was death as a business. Survivors reached out to the American soldiers with skeletal hands. They tried to speak French, Polish, Russian, Yiddish, German, a babble of desperate voices. Some wept. Others just stared, as if they couldn't quite believe that salvation had finally arrived. The soldiers immediately started pulling out their rations. Chocolate bars, canned food, bread. Here, take it, eat. But the medics quickly intervened, shouting for them to stop. "You'll kill them," the medics yelled. "Their bodies can't handle regular food. They'll eat and their stomachs will rupture. They'll die from the food." Think about that. These people were so starved that the very act of eating could kill them. Bass walked into one of the barracks. 3-tier bunks, packed with human beings. Some were alive. Some were dead. The living were too weak to remove the dead, so they just lay there together, the boundary between life and death almost invisible. Behind the barracks, he found something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Piles of bodies. Not dozens, not even hundreds. Thousands of naked corpses, stacked like cordwood, waiting to be burned. The Germans hadn't had time to destroy all the evidence before they fled. The crematorium ovens were still warm, still full of ashes. Human ashes. A white officer next to Bass bent over and vomited. Grown men, hardened combat soldiers, stood there crying openly, not caring who saw their tears. This was the moment everything changed. They finally understood what they were really fighting for. This wasn't just a war between armies. This was a war against absolute, unfathomable evil. Among the survivors, the African American soldiers noticed something that hit differently. There were black prisoners here too. Not many, but they were there. Mostly French colonial soldiers from Africa, captured back in 1940 when France fell. The Nazis had kept them separate from other POWs, in even worse conditions, because in the twisted Nazi racial hierarchy, black people were considered the lowest of the low. One survivor who spoke English explained it through an interpreter. The Nazis called black people Untermensch, subhuman, lower than Slavs, lower than Jews, the absolute bottom of their sick racial pyramid. They'd used black prisoners for medical experiments, trying to prove their insane theories about racial inferiority. Leon Bass stood there in Buchenwald, surrounded by the evidence of racial hatred taken to its ultimate conclusion. And he thought about home, about the whites-only signs, about the restaurants he couldn't enter, about the libraries closed to him. And suddenly he understood something profound. American segregation and Nazi genocide weren't different things. They were points on the same spectrum. Different degrees, yes, but the same poison at the root. The idea that some human beings are worth less than others because of how they look. That's where it starts. And this is where it can end. For these black soldiers, what they saw in those camps hit different. This wasn't just another mission. This was deeply, painfully personal. Leon Bass would later talk about standing in Buchenwald, surrounded by corpses, and his mind drifting back to his hometown in South Carolina. The public library with the sign, "Whites Only." He'd grown up blocks away from that library, but he'd never been allowed through those doors. He thought about the restaurants where he couldn't eat, the schools where black children weren't welcome, the lynchings that happened in the South, black men murdered by white mobs, their bodies left hanging as warnings. And here's the thing. What he saw at Buchenwald wasn't the same as American segregation. Not by a long shot. Gas chambers and crematoria were on a completely different level of horror. But the root, the foundation, that was identical. The belief that some people are inherently superior to others based on how they look. That some lives matter more than others. That you can divide humanity into categories of us and them, and do whatever you want to them. American segregation and Nazi genocide were different points on the same line. Different degrees of the same poison. The soldiers of the 92nd Infantry Division, an entirely African-American division that liberated several camps in Italy and southern Germany, felt this connection even more sharply. They were fighting for a country that didn't consider them equal citizens. Fighting against a regime that had taken racism to its ultimate, genocidal conclusion. Think about the irony. The absolute, bitter irony. Staff Sergeant Edward Carter Jr., a black soldier who would eventually receive the Medal of Honor, though not until 50 years after the war, because America wasn't ready to honor black heroes in 1945. Put it perfectly. He was liberating prisoners from concentration camps, but he couldn't freely walk into a restaurant in his hometown of Los Angeles. He could fight Nazis in Europe, but he couldn't sit at a lunch counter in California. Yet despite this bitter irony, or maybe because of it, what these soldiers saw in the camps strengthened their resolve. They understood now, with crystal clarity, where unchecked racism leads. They'd seen the endpoint, the final destination of racial hatred when nobody stands up to stop it. And they made a promise to themselves. Never again. Not here. Not anywhere. They'd fight the Nazis in Europe, and then they'd continue the fight against racism back home. The concentration camp survivors reacted to their black liberators in different ways. For many Europeans, especially those from Eastern Europe, this was the first time they'd ever seen a black person. Some stared in curiosity. Others didn't even notice skin color. When you're that close to death, a liberator is a liberator, period. But for the handful of black prisoners in the camps, and there were some, meeting African-American soldiers was almost surreal. They knew about America's racial segregation. They'd heard about the lynchings, the discrimination, the Jim Crow laws. And suddenly, here were black men in American uniforms, carrying weapons, commanding tanks and trucks, arriving as part of the army that was saving them. One French prisoner from Senegal told an American soldier through an interpreter, "I thought that in America, black people were treated like animals. But you came to save us on tanks." Reality, it turned out, was more complicated than propaganda. Yes, America had brutal racial segregation, but it also had black men fighting on the front lines, witnessing history's greatest crimes, and proving their humanity and courage in the face of ultimate evil. For a brief moment at Buchenwald, racial barriers between American soldiers started to dissolve. White soldiers who'd looked down on their black comrades days earlier were now working alongside them, digging mass graves for thousands of victims. The horror was so overwhelming that petty prejudices seemed absurd. Some white soldiers, confronted with the ultimate conclusion of racist ideology, started questioning their own beliefs for the first time. Maybe, just maybe, the Southern traditions they'd grown up with weren't just harmless customs. Maybe they were part of something darker. The camps became a mirror, and some people didn't like what they saw reflected back. After that first shock wore off, and it never fully wore off, came the hard work. The devastating, soul-crushing work of dealing with what the Nazis had left behind. African-American units, like their white counterparts, got assignments throughout the liberated camp system. And let me tell you, nobody wanted these assignments. But somebody had to do it. Engineering battalions, many of them African-American, worked to restore basic infrastructure. Water systems that had been deliberately sabotaged, electrical systems that had failed, barracks that needed repair to temporarily house survivors who were too sick to move. Medical units set up field hospitals right on the campgrounds, trying desperately to save people who were already more dead than alive. Doctors and medics worked around the clock, but many survivors died anyway, their bodies too damaged, too depleted, to recover even with medical care. Transportation units brought in tons of supplies, food, medicine, blankets, clothing. But it all had to be distributed carefully, methodically, under strict medical supervision. Rush it, and you'd kill the very people you were trying to save. Leon Bass and his fellow engineers got one of the worst jobs: burial detail. There were thousands of bodies, thousands, and they couldn't stay there. The threat of disease, of epidemic, was massive. They had to be buried, and fast. So, Bass and his unit brought in bulldozers and excavators and dug enormous mass graves. Then they loaded bodies, human beings who'd had names, families, dreams, onto trucks and into the ground. Day after day, body after body. The work was physically exhausting, but the psychological toll? That was worse, much worse. Many soldiers couldn't eat after their shifts. They'd sit in their mess tents, staring at their food, seeing something else entirely. Others couldn't sleep. They'd close their eyes and see faces. Skeletal faces with those huge, haunted eyes. Bodies stacked like lumber. Military psychiatrists in 1945 didn't have a name for what these men were experiencing. We call it PTSD now, post-traumatic stress disorder. But back then you just called it being shell-shocked and tried to push through. General Eisenhower, when he learned the full scope of what had happened in the camps, made a critical decision. He ordered journalists, photographers, and film crews brought in immediately. Document everything. Photograph everything. Film everything. Why? Because he knew. He knew that someday, maybe soon, people would try to deny this happened. They'd say it was exaggerated, made up, propaganda. So he wanted evidence. Overwhelming, undeniable evidence. African American soldiers appeared in those photographs and newsreels, working side by side with white soldiers. But here's the bitter truth. American media often edited them out, cut them from the frame, didn't show them. Even in documenting the liberation of concentration camps, even in recording one of history's greatest crimes, racial segregation found a way to erase black heroes from the story. America didn't want to show black soldiers as liberators. Didn't fit the narrative back home. Some units stayed in the camps for weeks, helping organize life for survivors who had nowhere to go. Many couldn't return home. Their families were dead, their houses destroyed, their countries under Soviet occupation. They were liberated from the camps but trapped in limbo. Soldiers shared everything they had: rations, cigarettes, their own clothes. They wrote letters for survivors to relatives in other countries. Friendships formed. Deep bonds forged in the worst circumstances imaginable. One African American soldier even adopted a Polish Jewish boy who'd survived the camps as an orphan. After the war, he brought the boy to America, where he grew up in a black family on the south side of Chicago. Stories like that were rare, but they showed something important. Humanity could survive even this. Compassion could exist even here. In the face of ultimate evil, there were still moments of grace. Buchenwald wasn't the end of the story. African American soldiers encountered the Nazi camp system throughout Germany and Austria, and what they saw left scars that would never fully heal. Let me tell you about the 761st Tank Battalion, the original Black Panthers. These guys were legendary. An all-black armored unit that had fought their way across Europe in Sherman tanks, earning respect on the battlefield even while facing discrimination from their own army. General Patton himself had praised them, saying they were among his best units. On May 2, 1945, just days before the war in Europe would end, the Black Panthers rolled their tanks toward a place called Gunskirchen in Austria, a subcamp of the Mauthausen concentration camp system. What they found there broke them. 15,000 Hungarian Jews, most of them so close to death they could barely be called alive. The camp was chaos, bodies everywhere, the dying mixed with the dead, prisoners crawling through mud because they couldn't stand. These were tankers. These were men who'd faced German panzers, who'd fought through the Battle of the Bulge, who'd seen the absolute worst of combat. They thought they'd seen everything war could throw at them. They were wrong. One survivor, a young woman named Sonia Weitz, later wrote a poem about the soldier who saved her. She called it The Black Messiah. The opening lines: "A black GI stood by the door. I never saw a black before. He'll set me free before I die. I thought, he must be the Messiah." She'd heard about America's racial segregation, the lynchings, the discrimination. And here was this black soldier, on a tank, with a gun, coming to save her life. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The men of the 761st did everything they could, carefully distributing food under medical supervision, providing water, helping move the sick to medical stations. But then the orders came. Move out. Keep advancing. They had to leave the survivors behind and push forward. As they climbed back into their tanks and rolled away from Gunskirchen, many of those hardened soldiers were in tears, thinking about what humans could do to other humans. Meanwhile, at Dachau, liberated on April 29, 1945, African American support units arrived in the days after liberation and found scenes just as horrifying. Railcars packed with thousands of corpses. Death trains the Germans had been running between camps. People who died from starvation, dehydration, suffocation, packed so tight they died standing up. Some American soldiers, seeing the SS guards who'd run these camps, lost it completely. They shot captured SS men on the spot, just executed them right there. Officially, nobody investigated too hard. Command understood. African American engineers, medical personnel, and support troops fanned out across dozens of camps. Mauthausen, Ohrdruf, countless smaller subcamps whose names most people have never heard. At every single one, the same horror. Skeletal survivors, mountains of corpses, crematoria, gas chambers. For the 761st Tank Battalion, it was Gunskirchen. For Leon Bass and the 183rd, it was Buchenwald. For thousands of other black soldiers in medical, engineering, and support units throughout the European theater, it was one of hundreds of camps scattered across Nazi-controlled territory. Each man had his own moment of horror, his own confrontation with the ultimate conclusion of racist ideology. And every single one of them carried that with them for the rest of their lives. When the war finally ended and soldiers started coming home, African American veterans faced a cruel awakening. Actually, it wasn't even an awakening. It was a return to reality. The reality they'd temporarily escaped in Europe. They came home to an America that hadn't changed at all. Leon Bass returned to South Carolina. On his very first day back, still in uniform, still wearing his service ribbons, he walked up to a diner. And there it was, same as always. Whites only. He'd just spent months in Germany. He'd walked through Buchenwald. He'd helped bury thousands of victims of racial hatred. He'd seen where racism leads when taken to its extreme. And he couldn't order a sandwich in his hometown. This was the experience of thousands of black veterans. They'd fought for freedom overseas. They'd liberated concentration camps. They'd proven their courage, their skill, their humanity beyond any doubt. And they came home to sit in the back of the bus. But something had changed. Not America. America was the same. They had changed. These men had seen too much. They'd witnessed the ultimate expression of racial ideology. They knew, with absolute certainty, that the Southern traditions and separate but equal laws back home were built on the same foundation as the Nazi death camps. Different degree, same poison. And they weren't going to stay quiet anymore. Many of these veterans became leaders in the civil rights movement. They had moral authority now. They'd literally fought fascism overseas. They'd liberated victims of genocide. Their experience gave them arguments that were hard to refute. We saw where racism leads, they said. We saw the camps. We saw the bodies. We're not letting it happen here. Not even a milder version. Leon Bass dedicated his entire life to education and fighting racism. He spoke at schools, universities, community centers, anywhere that would listen. He told his story about Buchenwald again and again, making sure people understood the connection between American segregation and Nazi genocide. He didn't say they were the same. They weren't. But he insisted they came from the same place. The same belief that some people matter less than others. Bass lived to be 90 years old. He died in 2015, leaving behind dozens of hours of recorded testimony. His voice, his story, preserved for future generations. The story of African American soldiers who witnessed and liberated Nazi concentration camps is a story about confronting absolute evil. It's about men who knew oppression seeing oppression taken to its ultimate extreme. They saw racism in its most genocidal form. They saw what happens when hatred goes unchecked, when those people become not people, when an entire society decides that certain lives don't matter. And they took that knowledge home with them. They fought Nazis in Europe. Then they came back and continued fighting racism in America. Their experience in the camps became part of the great civil rights movement. It became ammunition, moral, undeniable ammunition, in the fight for equality. These men proved something that should have been obvious but apparently wasn't. Dignity, courage, and humanity have nothing to do with the color of your skin.